My best friend walked into my daughter's wedding wearing my pearls, and she left with everything I had. And I did not understand any of it at first, because the day was supposed to be warm and simple and full of joy, and I had spent the whole morning telling myself to stay calm and not cry, even though my girl was getting married and stepping into a life that would not need me the same way anymore. And the crowd filled the hall and the music floated over the wooden floor, and I saw her walking down the aisle with her lace dress brushing the ground, and my heart rose like an old bird trying to take flight again. And then Evelyn stepped into view, and the world tilted just a little because she had those pearls on, the very ones my mother gave me before she passed. And I remember touching my neck because they should have been safe in my jewelry box where I left them. And I stood there watching her smile like nothing was out of place, and something in me rippled with a quiet tremble that I tried to swallow down because who ruins their daughter's wedding by asking questions? And I kept telling myself I must have misplaced them or lent them to her long ago and forgotten, but the truth kept tapping behind my ribs, and I could not quiet it no matter how I tried. The vows started, and my daughter's voice quivered, and for a second, I forgot everything else, and I just looked at her and saw the same little girl who used to slip her small hand into mine when she was scared of thunder, and my eyes softened as she promised love to a man who seemed gentle enough, though he never looked me fully in the eye, and even now he kept glancing at me like he was worried I might say something out loud. Something he was hoping would stay buried under the celebration, and people around me were smiling and whispering, while phones clicked and recorded, and yet my attention kept drifting back to Evelyn, because every time she moved, the pearls caught the light in that familiar soft glow that only those stones could make. And it hurt to see them sitting on someone else's skin like they had belonged there all her life. After the ceremony, everyone gathered near the reception hall, and I tried to shake the strange feeling from my shoulders because I wanted to be present for my daughter, but she kept brushing past me quick and distracted, and she did not hug me like she used to, and even when she laughed, it felt sharp on the edges, like she was pretending everything was perfect, even though something in her eyes said she was hiding a storm. And Evelyn hovered beside her like a second mother, or perhaps like someone who had already taken that place, and the thought made my throat tighten. The music played and people started dancing and the air smelled like roses and frosting, and I found myself standing alone near the back wall, while the newlyweds posed for photos and the photographer kept telling them to lean close and whisper sweet things. And I watched my daughter whisper something into her husband's ear, and whatever she said made him stiffen before he forced a laugh and kissed her cheek. And that same tapping fear in my chest grew stronger, because they kept glancing over at me like they were waiting for me to walk away or maybe disappear, and I could not make sense of why my own child would look at me like that on her happiest day. Evelyn came toward me with that gentle voice she always used when she wanted something, and she held my hands and told me I looked beautiful, and she said it with a smile that almost made me believe her, but then I saw the pearls again swaying against her dress as she moved, and the sight made everything inside me twist, and I asked her softly where she found them, and she blinked too fast and said I gave them to her months ago, and my stomach sank because I knew I never would have done that, and I wanted to ask more, but she touched my arm and told me not to worry and that today was about love and new beginnings, and she walked away before I could say another word. The hours slipped by in a haze of music and dim lights and the clinking of glasses and people dancing in circles and laughing and telling stories, but my mind kept circling the same thought like a tired bird circling a barren field, because something about Evelyn wearing my pearls was wrong on a level I could not name, and my daughter kept staying on the other side of the room as if she feared being too close to me, and every time our eyes met, she looked away quick as a startled child caught doing something she shouldn't, and I felt this small cold thread pulling across my heart, strand by strand. When the night ended and the couple prepared to leave, everyone lined up to wave sparklers and wish them well, and my daughter hugged everyone, but when she reached me, her hug was quick and tight, like she wanted to break free fast. And she whispered, "Thank you for everything," but it sounded like goodbye in a way I did not understand. And then she got into the car with her new husband, and I watched the door close, and the sparkler in my hand burned down to a tiny glowing stem, and I felt something quiet inside me crumble. Evelyn came up behind me, resting her hand lightly on my back, like we were still as close as we used to be, and she told me I should get some rest, and that big days can overwhelm people my age. And I almost laughed because she never used to talk to me like I was fragile, but tonight, everything felt different. And when she walked away, the pearls swayed one more time in that soft golden glow, and I knew I was not imagining any of this, because some changes come slow, and others arrive like an open wound, and I could feel that tonight was the beginning of something I was not ready for. When I finally got home, the house felt too quiet and too big, and I walked to my bedroom and opened the jewelry box, and the space where the pearls belonged was empty, and the air around me shifted and cooled, and I felt that first deep sting of betrayal beginning to settle, even though I could not yet see the full shape of it. And I stood there in the hush of my own room, with the faint smell of wedding flowers still clinging to my dress, and I whispered to myself that tomorrow I would sort this out. But tomorrow was already waiting with a truth I was not ready to face.
The morning after the wedding felt heavy from the moment I opened my eyes and sunlight pushed through the curtains in long, pale ribbons, and dust floated in the beams like quiet ghosts, drifting around my bed. And I tried to shake off the strange feeling from last night, but it clung to me like damp fabric that would not dry. And I sat up slow, rubbing my hands over my face, while the memory of Evelyn wearing my pearls replayed again and again until my mind was sore from touching it. And I walked through the house barefoot, listening to the way the boards creaked under my weight, like they wanted to tell me something. And I ended up in front of my vanity, where the jewelry box sat with its lid open just as I left it last night, and the empty space where the pearls belonged stared back at me like an accusation. I reached in and touched the indentation where the necklace always rested, and my chest tightened. And I told myself not to make assumptions because maybe I had misplaced them. Maybe I had given them to Evelyn earlier in the year. Maybe grief or age or stress had made me forget. And I tried to pull up every memory from the last 12 months, but none of them showed me handing my best friend the one thing my mother told me never to lose. And that thought made my breath stutter. And I shut the box with a soft thud that echoed through the quiet room. I walked to the kitchen to make tea, but the kettle rattled harder than usual on the stove, and even the water sounded sharp when it boiled, like the whole house was unsettled. And when I sat at the table, the steam from the cup curled around my face like warm breath. And I thought about my daughter and how she barely looked at me last night. And I wondered why she hugged me like someone running late for something they did not want to face. And I wondered why her new husband kept watching me, like he expected me to burst into flames right there in the middle of the dance floor. And the questions piled up inside me until the room felt smaller and smaller. Around noon, I decided to freshen up and go through the wedding gifts that had been dropped off in my living room, because the sight of the stacked boxes, the cards, the bows usually brought me joy. But today, the colorful paper only reminded me how much had changed in one night. And I started opening cards, reading messages from people, wishing my daughter happiness, laughter, and long life. And I stacked the envelopes neatly on the coffee table until something caught my eye. A small gift bag with a pale blue ribbon tied in a sloppy knot. And I recognized my daughter's handwriting on the tag. because she always wrote her letters with a slight curve like she was afraid of straight lines. And I opened the bag expecting something small and sentimental, but the inside was empty. Completely empty, as if someone had removed the gift after sealing it. And the bag smelled faintly of my perfume, the one Evelyn always complimented and borrowed whenever she visited, and my heart dropped, because this was the same brand that lingered on my jewelry box last night when I opened it. My throat tightened, and I grabbed my purse, thinking maybe I needed air, maybe I needed a walk, maybe I needed to shake this paranoia off before it swallowed me whole. But when I reached for my wallet, something felt strange. The zipper was half open, even though I always closed it. And I looked inside and saw that $50 were missing, then $100, then more. And my pulse started to pound in my ears because I remembered now the same thing happened last month. Small amounts gone, then replaced, then gone again. And I had blamed myself for being careless because who wants to believe someone close to them is taking from them? And my fingers began to tremble as I checked the other pockets and found nothing but receipts, faded with time. I sat back in my chair for a long while, listening to my breath going in and out like slow waves, pulling back from a quiet shoreline, and I told myself to stay calm and do one sensible thing before letting fear pull me into the deep. So I walked to my desk and turned on the old computer, the one that took its time waking up like an old friend stretching its limbs, and I opened my bank account and waited for the page to load. And my stomach dropped when I saw the numbers because they were lower than they should be, much lower. And there were transactions I did not recognize, withdrawals small at first, then bigger, then far too big, and my hand moved to my chest as if trying to hold my heart in place because the dates lined up perfectly with the weeks leading up to the wedding. I scrolled through each entry, feeling each one like a soft punch to the ribs, and part of me wanted to believe it was a glitch, some clerical error that would be fixed with one phone call. But deep down, I knew the truth was sitting closer to home, and the memory of my daughter avoiding my eyes last night suddenly felt sharper. And the memory of Evelyn touching my back and telling me I looked overwhelmed took on a new edge. And I felt tears pressing behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall because I needed my mind clear. I needed to think. I needed to understand what exactly was happening around me. I turned off the computer and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling where sunlight shimmered as clouds moved across the sky. And I whispered to myself that maybe I should talk to my daughter. Maybe she had seen something. Maybe she had noticed strange things too. But then I remembered how she rushed through her hug, how she pulled away fast as if scared to linger too close. And that thought made my chest ache. And I stood up, pacing from wall to wall, listening to my footsteps bounce around the room like nervous whispers. By late afternoon, I decided to check one last thing before letting my imagination run wild, because maybe if I saw nothing else missing, I could calm myself down and let the world settle again. So I went to my bedroom, opened the small safe hidden behind the old framed painting of a seascape my mother loved, and I typed the code with slow, careful fingers. And when the door opened, a thin, cold air slipped out, and I felt my breath freeze, because inside the safe where my gold bangles should be, there was an empty felt box lying on its side, like someone had tossed it back in a hurry. And the bangles were gone, as if they had been lifted without a sound. And I backed away from the safe, pressing my mouth to quiet the sound that rose in my throat because this was no mistake. This was no accident. This was someone I trusted, someone close, someone with a key, someone who knew the code, someone who moved through my home with the ease of family. And I stood there, trembling, fighting the wave rising through my body because this felt like the start of a story I never wanted to live. I walked out of the bedroom and leaned on the wall and whispered to myself that I would ask Evelyn, I would ask my daughter, I would ask, and they would tell me something that made sense, even if I did not like hearing it. But before I could plan anything, the phone on the hall table buzzed softly with a notification, and I looked at the screen, expecting some random message, but it was a bank alert telling me another transfer had just been made in the last hour, and I knew then this was not over, and I knew someone was still taking from me even now, and I felt the ground shift beneath me like a slow, quiet earthquake that only I could feel. And in that moment, I understood that losing pearls at a wedding was only the first small ripple, and the real storm was still waiting just beyond the door.
I stood there with the bank alert glowing on my phone screen, and the house felt too still around me, like the walls were holding their breath and waiting to see what I would do next. And I walked to the couch and sat down slow because my legs felt unsteady, like they were remembering something before my mind did. And I kept reading the alert over and over until the numbers blurred. And I whispered to myself that maybe it was a mistake, or maybe someone had stolen my card, or maybe the bank mixed up the accounts. But the truth kept rising like a tide that refused to go back, and I felt it pulling at my chest until I could hardly breathe. The afternoon slipped into early evening, and the sky outside turned the color of old peach skins, while birds crossed in quiet flocks, heading home to their trees. And I stood at the window, feeling the weight of that silence pressing around my shoulders. And I thought of my daughter again, and how she used to sit in this same room as a teenager, telling me everything about her day, her friends, her dreams, her fears, and how she would lay her head on my shoulder and say, "Mama, you are my safe place." And now she barely looked at me at her own wedding. And I kept wondering, what changed so quietly that I never heard it happen? I reached for the landline phone because part of me wanted to call her right then and ask her if she knew anything, if she had seen anything, if she had noticed anything wrong. And my hand hovered over the numbers, but I could still feel the way she hugged me last night. Too fast, too tight, like someone closing a door in my face gently so I would not hear the lock turn. And I pulled my hand back because I knew if I heard her voice and she lied to me, I would break right there in my living room, and I was not ready to shatter yet, not without knowing more. So instead, I decided to start small, start simple, start with something that seemed harmless. And I walked to my study where I kept every financial document, every estate paper, every folder marked with dates and names and signatures. And I pulled the drawer open and began flipping through binders that smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. But as I searched, I felt my heart drop because one folder was missing, the black leather one with the gold corner clips, the one that held every record of my estate, all my account numbers, all my copies of old wills and new updates and letters and proofs. And that folder was always kept in the same place. And now the space was empty, like someone had plucked it out with careful fingers. I reached deeper into the drawer, thinking maybe it slid back or maybe I misplaced it, though I never misplace anything important. But the drawer was bare and cold, and I felt my hands start to shake because losing pearls was one thing, losing money was another. But losing the entire estate folder was a different kind of wound, because no one would take that unless they planned something bigger, something deeper, something that needed every detail of my life laid out in their hands. I leaned on the desk and tried to steady myself, and I whispered my daughter's name, hoping saying it out loud would remind me of every good moment between us. But instead, it reminded me of the way she avoided my eyes last night, and a heaviness settled along my shoulders like someone draped a wet blanket over me. And I stood there swallowing the truth I had been trying so hard not to taste. I walked back to the living room, thinking I should call the bank or the police or maybe Evelyn to ask if she had seen the folder, because she used to help me organize things. But the thought of her wearing my pearls last night rose again like a bruise under thin skin, and I sat down on the edge of the couch, staring at the floor while the old clock on the wall ticked in slow, steady beats, like a faint heartbeat calming a restless child. And I listened to that sound until I felt strong enough to stand again. As the sky darkened, I decided to check the spare room where my daughter used to stay when she visited. And I pushed the door open, expecting the same crisp bedspread and folded blankets. But something felt off in the air, like someone had been there recently, like someone had moved through the room with rushed steps. And I walked to the dresser and pulled the drawers open,
and each one smelled faintly of my perfume. Again, that same scent that clung to the empty gift bag and the jewelry box. And my breath caught because I knew I had not been in that room for weeks, and the scent should not be there. I checked the closet, and a hanger lay on the floor like someone grabbed something in a hurry and left without caring how they put things back. And I knelt down to pick it up, but when I stood again, I noticed a small smudge on the closet door near the handle, a tiny streak of foundation makeup, the same shade Evelyn always used, and my body tensed like a violin string pulled too tight because this was no accident, and I knew for certain now that Evelyn had been in my house without me knowing, and she had been in this room recently, and she had moved around freely enough to leave pieces of herself behind. I stepped back from the door feeling a tremor travel through my hands because the truth was no longer creeping. It was standing right in front of me, breathing slow and steady, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And I whispered to myself that maybe she came here to borrow something, maybe she came to surprise me, maybe she came with my daughter for some innocent reason, but the words tasted wrong even as I spoke them, because nothing about this felt innocent. I walked back out of the room and closed the door gently, leaning my forehead against the wood, and in that moment I felt the quietest kind of grief rise from somewhere deep inside me. Not loud, not sharp, but soft and heavy, like a blanket laid over a sleeping child. And I stood there letting the weight settle because I knew I had reached a point where I could not pretend anymore, not even to comfort myself. As I walked back down the hall, the phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen, hoping for a message from my daughter, maybe something simple like, "Mama, we made it home," or "Mama, thank you for being there." But it was another bank alert, this time showing an internal transfer, one that could only be done with security access. And my breath came unsteady as I read the line 3 times, trying to convince myself I saw it wrong. But the truth was right there glowing on the screen in small, clear letters, and it felt like a hand tightening around my chest. I sat down again, staring at the carpet while the house around me grew darker with each passing minute, and I whispered softly that tomorrow I would call the bank, tomorrow I would change the passwords, tomorrow I would ask the questions I had been too afraid to ask, but I also knew that by tomorrow something else might be taken, something deeper, something I could not replace. And as the night settled thick and quiet around me, I realized that whatever was happening had already begun long before I noticed the first missing thing, and now the only question left was how far the people I loved had already gone.
By the time the next week rolled in, Evelyn had begun appearing in ways that made me notice every movement she made, like I was seeing her for the first time. And the first morning I saw her at a cafe with a new coat, a bag that had cost more than anything I had bought for myself in years, and a ring glinting on her finger that I knew I had never seen before, my stomach sank because the quiet truth was settling in that she had gained something, and I did not know how. And the way she smiled at the waiter and spoke with a voice polished and confident made my skin crawl, because that was not the Evelyn I remembered from our afternoons of tea and old photographs and shared secrets. She was someone else, someone polished and distant, someone dangerous in the quietest way possible. I noticed the changes creeping into her daily life everywhere I went or looked on social media or even overheard in the town square. She was driving new cars, wearing clothes that cost more than the small shop I ran for years, and dining in places we had only visited on special occasions before. And every time I saw her, I felt that soft twist of dread in my stomach, because I knew something had shifted, and it was not just about the pearls. It was bigger than that. It was something that had begun moving and growing long before my eyes could catch it. And then there was my daughter, whose behavior had steadily changed since the wedding. Her laughter came at odd times, or stopped abruptly when I entered a room. She once ran to greet me with news about her day, and now she barely stayed on the phone longer than a minute, and her words, when we spoke, felt rehearsed, like she was aware of some invisible line I could not see. And every time she came home for a visit, She spent more time with Evelyn than with me, and I watched them together, sometimes feeling the pulse of unease like electricity in the air. Because the way my daughter leaned in when Evelyn spoke, the way her eyes sparkled with amusement or agreement, it was familiar in a way that made me ache. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining the coincidences. But the coincidences kept piling up until I could no longer breathe around them without feeling exposed. And every time Evelyn laughed or smiled in public, it felt like a dagger sliding across my ribs because I had never expected a friend to take what was mine, what belonged to my family, what was entrusted to her as a person I had loved and trusted since I was young. And now the warmth we shared was gone, replaced with this chill I could not name. And the pearls were just the start, a first small stone that fell and started an avalanche. One afternoon, I saw her at the grocery store with bags heavier than I could carry, and the corners of her lips curved in a way that told me she had been winning, even if I did not understand the rules of the game she was playing. And I walked past pretending to look at the vegetables, but every fiber of me was alert because the first time the missing money alerts came through and the jewelry vanished had been in small increments. But now the way she carried herself, the way her laughter floated down the aisles like a bell, I knew she had amassed more than just borrowed treasures. I could see it in the subtle richness in her appearance, in the confidence that radiated off her like the sunlight, and I felt a strange mix of fear and fury that made my hands tremble. The days stretched into evenings where I could not rest because my thoughts were crowded with images of her wearing the pearls of my mother and my daughter laughing along and counting little victories in the corners of their eyes that I was not meant to see. And I realized that I was watching a slow transformation unfolding in front of me, and no one seemed to notice it or care that the person they trusted had already stepped into a place they did not belong. And each night I would close my eyes and feel the weight of it pressing down like water into my chest, and I would whisper to myself that I had to do something, even if I did not yet know what. By midweek, my courage started to stretch like a muscle I had not used in years, and I began to observe every detail, every transaction, every casual remark, because something in me knew the slow pattern was building a path to something larger, something that would show me exactly how far the betrayal had gone. And I noticed the way Evelyn spoke to service people, the way she asked questions about account openings and insurance policies in passing. And I felt my pulse rise because the threads of the web were weaving so tight around my family that I could almost see them in the air, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would be too late. And yet I held back because my daughter still wore the innocence of childhood in certain moments, and I wanted to believe in her still. I wanted to hold on to that sliver of light that said she would not hurt me willingly. And I watched her from a distance sometimes, pretending to do chores or errands while I observed, and I caught glimpses of her hesitating over a word or a gesture, and my heart twisted, and I thought maybe there was still a chance to save what was left before it all fell apart. And I whispered to myself that I would gather the proof I needed and then confront them both in a way that would leave no doubt, no denial, no hiding place. And each time I returned home at night, the house seemed quieter than it should be, like it was bracing itself for some revelation that I could feel creeping through the walls like a slow fog. And I would stand at the kitchen window looking out over the street and imagine the moment when the truth came fully into the light. And I realized that my own pulse was echoing in the tiles like a warning drum, and that the small steps of suspicion had now grown into a path I could follow. And I would follow it even if it led me to heartbreak or confrontation, because I had to reclaim what belonged to me, and I had to see the faces of those who betrayed me and understand why the people I loved had turned into shadows in my life.
My daughter's coldness became a weight I could no longer ignore, and I felt it in the way she answered my calls, short and clipped, her voice carrying a distance I had never heard before. And every time I saw her in person, she lingered at the edge of the room like a bird afraid to come close, and her new husband hovered near her side as if guarding her from me. And the thought made my chest tighten because it was not just the money or the pearls or the missing folder. It was the way they had begun to treat me like I no longer belonged in my own home, like the person I had nurtured for 20 years had quietly put a wall between us, and I could not remember the last time she looked at me with warmth, without hesitation, without a hidden edge. And each encounter left me hollow and dizzy, as if the world had been tilted and I was still trying to find balance. One evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end was soft but chilling, whispering things I was not ready to hear, and I held the receiver tight, hoping it was a mistake or a prank, but the words cut through me slowly like a knife pressed under skin, and I knew immediately that someone close had been moving behind the scenes and was warning me to stop digging or asking questions or noticing too much, and the fear that had been building in quiet waves now crashed into me like ice water, and I could barely stand to listen as the voice spoke of consequences and threats, veiled as concern, and I ended the call shaking and staring at the receiver as if it held the shape of the person who had dared to speak that way to me. My daughter avoided me even more after that, and each time I tried to reach out, she moved like quicksilver out of grasp, her eyes darting away or filling with fleeting emotion that vanished before I could catch it. And I realized that whatever had begun weeks ago, with missing pearls, missing money, and quiet manipulations, had become a full pattern. A careful orchestration that left me uncertain of every gesture, every word, every smile I had once trusted. And I began watching them closely, noticing the small details, the side glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, and the way their laughter sometimes held a secret edge that I could feel but could not name. And the most painful moments were the ones that came quietly, like a slow wind slipping through an open door. The evenings when my daughter would sit across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on her phone, and I would ask her something simple like, "How was your day?" or "Did you enjoy the wedding?" and she would nod softly but not meet my gaze. And every word felt rehearsed, like it was practiced in front of a mirror before it left her lips. And the warmth we had once shared between us vanished, leaving only this tension, this quiet accusation hanging in the air like dust that refuses to settle. I began noticing how her new husband behaved around me too, watching the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his hand hovered near hers like he was always ready to pull her away from me, and the way he smiled at me carefully like he was measuring my reactions before deciding how to respond. And my chest ached because the child I had raised now leaned on someone who seemed to guard her against me. And the betrayal was not just about objects or money, it was about love misplaced and trust broken in ways that cut deeper than anything I had felt before. And I felt a slow heat rise in my belly that was equal parts fear and fury. I tried to find courage in old memories, in the mornings when she would curl up on my lap and whisper secrets about school and friends, and I would stroke her hair and tell her everything would be all right. But those days were gone. And now every interaction felt like walking on a frozen lake where one wrong step could make the ice crack beneath me. And I kept telling myself I needed proof. I needed clarity before I confronted anyone, before I let emotion dictate the next move, because I knew the stakes were higher than they had ever been, and I had to be ready. And then came the afternoon when I discovered that my estate binder was completely gone, and it hit me like a punch to the chest because the folder contained everything. Every letter, every account number, every legal document, and I realized that the pattern of missing objects and funds was no longer random, it was deliberate, and the person who had orchestrated it had deep access, and the realization made my hands tremble and my mind whirl, because the person who had been my friend, the person who had once shared my laughter and tears, was now someone who had stepped across a line I had never imagined anyone could cross. And I remember standing in my study, staring at the empty space where the folder had always rested, feeling the weight of the betrayal pressing into my bones, and I whispered my daughter's name softly, because even in this moment, I wanted to believe she was not fully part of it, that she could be reasoned with. But the more I replayed our interactions, the more I realized that she had already aligned herself with Evelyn, and the truth settled like cold fog across my chest, that the people I had loved and trusted most had become conspirators in a plan I was only beginning to see. And the fear that rose from that understanding was sharp and bitter, and it made me shiver from head to toe. And so I sat there quiet, listening to the house breathe around me, feeling the faint hum of lights and the soft ticking of the clock, and I knew I had to act carefully because any wrong move could push them further away, any question could alert them to my suspicion,
And I also knew that if I did nothing, the pattern would continue and escalate, and I would lose everything, not just my possessions, but the fragile threads of trust that had held us together, and I realized that I had reached a point where I could no longer stand by. I had to gather evidence, find the truth, and prepare to face the betrayal in full, knowing that what awaited me could shatter the life I had known completely.
The morning after the estate binder vanished, I woke before sunrise with a strange heaviness in my chest and a quiet certainty that the house was no longer mine in spirit. And as I moved through the hallway, I felt watched, even though I knew I was alone, and that feeling pushed me to check every drawer, every shelf, every cabinet, because something deep inside me whispered that the betrayal had already moved far beyond small tests or quiet manipulations. And when I reached the study again, the air felt different, as if the room itself remembered what had been taken from it. And I touched the space on the desk where the binder once rested, and my hand shook, because I could almost feel the outline of everything that was gone. And I whispered a prayer under my breath, asking for clarity, strength, and a little courage, because I knew I would need all three before this ended. And when I sat down, the silence wrapped around me like a cold blanket. And for a moment, I simply breathed and tried to sort my thoughts, because the fear was no longer a whisper. It was a pulse that throbbed in my throat every time I realized how trapped I truly was. I decided that morning I would no longer move blindly through the days, hoping things would fix themselves, because something had shifted in my daughter, and her sudden distance was not a phase or misunderstanding. It was a decision shaped by someone else's influence. And I saw it in her eyes every time she looked at me like a stranger wearing her mother's face. And I knew that if I kept waiting for her to come back to herself, I would lose far more than a binder or pearls or money. I would lose the last chance to protect what I had built over a lifetime. And so I walked into the kitchen slowly and found my phone on the counter and scrolled through old messages, searching for patterns, searching for clues. And each conversation from the past weeks felt rehearsed, cold, crafted to soothe me without revealing anything real. And the more I read, the more the truth began to form like a dark shape rising through water. And I felt the urge to cry, but nothing came out, only the stillness that scared me more than tears ever could. I made tea to steady myself, but even the steam rising from the cup felt off, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. And while I stood there, I remembered the mysterious phone call, the one with the soft, chilling voice that warned me to stop asking questions, and suddenly the threads of the situation began to weave together in a way that made my heart race. Because the warning was not random, not a prank. It was the voice of someone who knew me well, someone who understood exactly which words would frighten me into silence. And that realization sat heavy in my stomach, because the circle of people who fit that description was painfully small, and none of those possibilities brought comfort. I started paying attention to details I had ignored before, like the way Evelyn always appeared at the house at convenient moments, her soft smile slipping into place like a mask, and how she moved through my kitchen with the ease of someone who felt entitled to belong there, and how she always steered conversations toward wills, finances, inheritance, while pretending it was harmless curiosity. And I remembered the evening she handed me a new brand of tea, said it was gentle on the nerves. And for the first time, I wondered if her kindness was simply a way of placing herself inside my routine, inside my guards, inside my trust. And the thought made my hands tremble, so I set the cup aside, untouched, and stepped away from the counter, feeling heat rise up the back of my neck. My daughter entered the house later that afternoon, and her eyes swept the room with quick, sharp movements, like she was checking if anything had changed. And when she saw me standing near the window, her face softened for a split second before tightening again, and she greeted me in a voice that felt polite but hollow. And I watched her carefully, trying to read the flickers of emotion behind her expression, and I saw guilt flash across her face so quickly it almost disappeared before I caught it. And something inside me sank. Because guilt is not born from nothing, it grows from choices and secrets and alliances made in silence.
and I saw all of that reflected in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it. I wanted to ask her why she was pulling away, why she had let Evelyn wedge herself between us, why she no longer sought comfort in me the way she once did, but the words stuck in my throat because I feared the answer more than the silence, and I feared that asking would push her deeper into whatever plan was unfolding around me. So I simply watched her as she unpacked bags she had not told me she would bring, as she moved through the house with quiet purpose, placing items in drawers and closets as though preparing for a future that did not include me. And the unease tightened around my ribs until every breath felt thin and shallow. I excused myself and stepped into the backyard, needing air, needing space, needing a moment where no one's eyes followed me. And as the wind rustled through the trees, I felt the first spark of something I had not felt in a long time. Resolve. A calm, steady resolve that grew in my chest with each passing second, because I knew now that I was not imagining anything. The warnings, the missing items, the shifting attitudes, the careful choreography of distance and suspicion, everything pointed to a plan that had been slowly circling me, tightening around me with patient intent, and if I did not act soon, I would be swallowed by it. So I stood there watching the sky darken above the roofline and whispered to myself that the time of waiting was over, and the next step needed to be deliberate, measured, and quiet, because the people moving against me were closer than shadows, and the moment I revealed I understood their game, the game would change, and not in my favor. And as I stared at the fading light, I told myself that I would uncover the truth piece by piece, no matter who it exposed or how deeply it hurt, because I deserved answers and I deserved my life back, and I was no longer willing to be the silent target in a plan I had never agreed to be part of.
The next morning, the house felt too quiet in a way that made my skin prickle, and I moved through the hallway with slow, steady steps because something in the air told me I was about to see something that would change everything. And when I reached the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was the faint scent of my perfume, the one I kept in my bedroom drawer, the one I rarely used anymore, and that scent hanging in the kitchen felt like a silent alarm because no one should have touched it. And for a long moment, I stood there, listening to the refrigerator hum while my pulse climbed higher, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe I had carried the scent with me without noticing. But the lie did not land because I felt the truth in my bones. Something or someone was exploring parts of my life I had not invited them into, and that thought sent a cold shiver through me that reached the back of my knees. I walked upstairs, guided by a voice inside me that kept whispering, "Check your room, check it now." And the closer I got to my door, the heavier the air became, as if the walls themselves knew what I was about to find. And when I pushed the door open, the room looked normal, tidy, untouched. But the stillness was too perfect, too staged, like someone had put everything back in place but did not know how my belongings truly lived. And I stepped toward my vanity and saw the faint imprint of a hand on the edge, a small smear of powder disturbed, and my heart thudded so loudly I could feel it in my fingertips. And without thinking, I opened my top drawer and saw the truth staring back at me, because my perfume bottle had been moved slightly forward, not much, just enough to betray the presence of a stranger. And beside it, the soft jewelry pouch that held my grandmother's ring was unzipped, as if someone had peeked inside and slid it closed again. I closed the drawer slowly, trying to steady my breathing because this was no longer about money or wills or inheritance. This was about intrusion. This was about ownership. This was about someone slowly erasing the boundaries of my life. And when I turned around, I caught sight of a small folded paper on my pillow, white, crisp, neat, and my hands began to tremble as I reached for it, because every instinct in me screamed that whatever waited inside that fold would change something in me forever. And when I opened it, I saw 5 words written in a soft looping script that looked painfully familiar. "Stop digging or you lose everything." And my knees weakened because the handwriting was not that of a stranger. It was a handwriting I had seen in birthday cards, in grocery lists, in notes left on my fridge. And that realization cracked something inside me so sharply that I had to sit on the edge of the bed before I fell. I held the note for a long time, waiting for my mind to catch up to the truth
that sat heavy in my hands, because only two people in my life wrote like this, my daughter and Evelyn. And the letters leaned forward with the same confident slant my daughter used in school, though Evelyn had a similar flair, and that confusion twisted through me like a blade because I wanted to believe my daughter would never threaten me. Yet everything around me pointed toward a growing alliance built on secrets I was never meant to discover. And I felt a quiet ache grow in my chest as I stared at the paper and wondered how long ago I had started losing my daughter without noticing the slow retreat of her trust, the slow cooling of her voice, the slow shift of her heart. When I finally stood, the world felt tilted, and my reflection in the mirror looked like a woman standing at the edge of something dark and endless. And yet, behind that fear, a slow, steady strength rose up, because if someone wanted me scared, they were about to learn I had survived far worse storms. And I tucked the note into the back of my photo album, the one hidden inside the cedar chest, because something told me I would need proof later. And as I closed the chest, the phone in my pocket buzzed, and seeing my daughter's name on the screen sent a ripple of dread through me. But I answered because avoiding her would only confirm I sensed the danger. Her voice sounded sweet, almost too sweet, as she asked where I had been all morning, and something in her tone felt rehearsed, like someone had coached her on what to say to keep me calm, and a soft tapping echoed behind her voice, as if she was in someone else's house, maybe Evelyn's, and the pause between her sentences felt loaded, heavy, uncertain, and I realized she was checking to see if I had found something, and my chest tightened because innocence does not ask questions like that. And I answered gently, pretending I was simply cleaning, and her relief was so clear, so audible, that my heart cracked in a new way, a painful, heavy way, because I was her mother, and she was relieved I did not know what she had done. When the call ended, the silence around me felt poisonous, so I left the room and walked through the hallway with my palms pressed together, trying to keep myself steady. And I knew I needed answers, real answers, not guesses, not suspicions, and I needed them soon. But I also knew whoever was behind this had already entered my home, my privacy, my routines, and it would take more than confrontation to uncover the truth because they were playing a long game, a quiet, measured game, and I needed to be even quieter. I went into the attic where old memories lived untouched, and I opened the storage boxes that held decades of letters, cards, documents, and I traced my fingers across envelopes with my daughter's childhood handwriting and letters from Evelyn from the early years when our friendship was full of laughter and safety and trust. And reading those old lines felt surreal because the warmth in those words no longer matched the coldness in her eyes now, and I realized something painful and undeniable. They had both known me long enough to know exactly how to get to me, how to unsettle me, how to make me doubt myself. And that history made the betrayal cut deeper than any knife ever could. As I sat among the boxes, dust swirling in the golden attic light, I understood something with a clarity that hit me straight in the heart. I was no longer dealing with accidents or misunderstandings or temporary distance. I was dealing with intent and strategy, and a plan designed to push me out of my own life, step by careful step. And if I did not move soon, I would wake up one day and find everything I loved, everything I built, everything I fought for, placed in someone else's hands. And sitting there in the quiet, I whispered to myself that the time of fear was ending, because the truth was circling me now, close enough to touch, and I would keep pulling at every thread until the whole thing unraveled, no matter whose hands were tangled in it, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how deep I had to dig.
By the time evening came, the house felt heavier than usual, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward me as if they knew what I had discovered. And I paced the living room, slowly tracing my hands along the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the smooth, polished surfaces that had always been familiar and comforting, but now felt alien and untrustworthy. And I thought about Evelyn and my daughter together at the wedding, laughing and wearing my pearls. And I felt a hot ache rise through my chest because what started as small thefts had turned into a quiet takeover of everything I held dear. And I realized that they had been planning this for months, moving in tandem,
Their whispers, their smiles, their rehearsed gestures, all pieces of a puzzle I had only begun to see. And the thought made my hands tremble as I clutched the edge of the couch and breathed slow to keep from panicking. I went through the photo albums on the coffee table, tracing images of birthdays, holidays, vacations, the small snapshots of life I had captured over decades. And I felt a strange, sharp pain because these moments now carried a shadow I could not remove. The smiles frozen in print felt hollow, knowing that behind the lens, one of the people I trusted most was already plotting. And my heart ached, thinking of my daughter, too young, once so full of warmth and love, now sliding into a role orchestrated by someone I had called a friend. And every memory was tinged with a sense of betrayal that crawled under my skin and wrapped around my ribs like a tightening vine. The tea I had left cooling on the counter now steamed faintly in the dim light of the room, and I poured it into a cup and held it in both hands, letting the warmth ground me while I considered my next move. Because I knew I could not confront them blindly, I needed evidence, real evidence that could not be denied or twisted. And the thought of legal battles, courtrooms, arguments, and the long, slow grind of reclaiming what was mine made my stomach turn. But I also knew there was no turning back, no pretending nothing was wrong, because the moment I hesitated, I risked losing more than money or possessions. I risked losing the last vestiges of my family and the last shreds of my own dignity. I checked the old filing cabinet one more time, running my fingers along folders labeled with account numbers, statements, correspondence, anything that could prove that what had been taken was deliberate. And I felt the familiar thrill of determination rising up my spine because, even in the face of betrayal, I still had the tools, the memory, the knowledge, and the will to fight back. And each piece of paper, each faded envelope, each handwritten note was a weapon, a reminder that I had fought my entire life to protect what was mine, and I could do it again. Night deepened, and the house grew quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. And I felt the weight of silence pressing down around me like a tide. And I thought about Evelyn one more time, about the way she smiled at my daughter, about the way she had stepped quietly into every corner of my life. And I felt a shiver that was equal parts fear and resolve because I knew she had underestimated me just as my daughter had, and underestimating me had always been a mistake because I had seen storms come and go, and I had survived, and I would survive this one too. I walked to the window and looked out at the dark street, the pale glow of streetlights reflected in the glass, and I whispered softly to myself that tomorrow I would begin pulling the threads together and uncover the truth that had been hidden from me for too long. And I could feel the pulse of strength inside my chest, like a quiet drum that would not stop beating until I had reclaimed what had been taken. And I would face them both, the friend who betrayed me and the child who had let herself be swayed. And I would not flinch because I was ready to see the full extent of what had been done in my absence, and I would make sure that nothing would remain hidden from my eyes ever again. And as I turned away from the window, the house felt still but somehow watchful, as if it too was waiting for the confrontation to come. And I felt a cold fire rise inside me, a mixture of fear, rage, and determination that pulsed with every step I took through the silent rooms. And I whispered again to myself that I would gather the evidence, follow the trail, and face them, no matter how painful the truth was, because some betrayals can be forgiven, but no betrayal could take away my will, my memory, my sense of justice, or my right to protect everything I had spent a lifetime building. The next morning, I woke with the first gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains, and the house felt heavy with secrets that pressed against the walls like invisible hands. And I moved carefully through the rooms, checking every corner, every drawer, every shelf, because I had learned that nothing could be trusted, nothing could be taken at face value, and each time my fingers brushed a folder, a photograph, a note, I felt the pulse of the betrayal all around me. And I thought of Evelyn and my daughter together at the wedding. And in quiet moments before the world fully woke, I saw their smiles, as if frozen in a photograph, but now carrying the weight of deception. And I realized that what had seemed small at first, pearls, money, a missing binder,
was now a careful choreography of control that had been building under my nose, and my chest tightened as I breathed in slowly, trying to steady the storm rising inside me. I sat at the kitchen table, running my hands along the smooth surface, tracing the rings and scratches that told the story of decades, and I thought of the quiet letters my daughter used to leave tucked in my wallet, the small notes Evelyn had written in the early years of friendship, and I felt the contrast like a knife pressed under my ribs, because the hands that once built trust were now weaving a network of lies around me, and I realized that I had to act carefully, deliberately, and with full awareness, because any misstep could cost me everything. And yet, in the quiet fear I felt, a spark of resolve that grew steadily, because I would not be outmaneuvered, not by a friend, not by a daughter, not by anyone who thought they could take what was mine. I decided to start with small evidence, reviewing account statements, cross-referencing transfers, checking old correspondence for any hint of unusual activity. And each discovery made my pulse climb higher as I pieced together the deliberate movements that had been executed quietly without my notice. And the truth became undeniable that Evelyn and my daughter were working together in a way that had been invisible to me until now, and I felt a mix of grief and anger and determination all at once, because this was no longer about theft or loss, it was about reclaiming control and understanding the depth of their intentions. By mid-morning, I had gathered enough to see a pattern, a sequence of careful manipulations and movements that extended over weeks and months, and I realized that confronting them without preparation would be useless because they were already skilled at hiding and twisting reality. But the strength that had always carried me through life was present again, steady, unwavering, and I resolved that I would document everything, every note, every altered account, every suspicious conversation, because one day soon I would confront them and every piece of truth would stand solid, unshakable against their lies and evasions. As I moved through the living room, I felt the house itself shift around me as if it was sensing the coming storm. And I looked at the photographs lining the shelves, the happy faces frozen in time, the memories of birthdays, vacations, ordinary afternoons, and I understood that these were the stakes, not just money or inheritance, but the story of my life, my family, my love, my trust. And I would protect it all, because no betrayal, no matter how clever, could erase bond I had nurtured through decades of devotion and presence. And as evening approached, the shadows lengthened, and I felt the quiet heartbeat of the house under my feet, and I whispered softly to myself that soon I would move forward slowly, carefully, gathering the evidence that would make them accountable, because I had survived betrayals before. I had faced storms before, and I would face this one too, and I would do it fully awake, fully prepared, and fully determined to reclaim what belonged to me, even if it meant facing my daughter and the friend I once trusted most. And I would not flinch, because the time for fear had passed and the time for truth had arrived.
That night, the house felt almost alive with quiet tension, as if every wall, every floorboard, every corner had absorbed the whispers of the past weeks, and I moved through it slowly, each step measured, my hands tracing surfaces that once brought comfort, now feeling foreign, because the trust I had held had been replaced by a constant awareness of betrayal. And I thought of my daughter, sitting across from me at the kitchen table weeks ago, her voice soft yet distant, her eyes avoiding mine, and I felt a flicker of grief pierce through the rising determination, because part of me still longed for the warmth we had shared, for the girl who used to confide in me, for the daughter who had once been my safe place. And yet I knew that longing could not blind me to the reality that she was part of the scheme orchestrated by the friend I had once trusted more than anyone else. I spent hours that night gathering papers, notes, account statements, letters, everything that could prove the deliberate nature of what had been done, and I laid them out across the living room floor, methodically tracing the connections between transfers, visits, notes, and conversations, the way a detective might follow a thread across a crime scene. And as I worked, I felt a slow fire rise inside me, a mixture of fear, anger, and clarity. Because each piece of evidence told a story of calculated betrayal, and I understood that this was bigger than pearls, bigger than missing money, bigger than anything I had first imagined. And it would take every ounce of patience and courage to confront it fully. I thought about Evelyn and how she moved through my home so confidently, so quietly, like she owned every corner. And I remembered her smiles, her small gestures, the way she had ingratiated herself into every routine and memory. And I realized that she had underestimated me because she believed I would be too shocked, too timid, too emotionally compromised to fight back. And I felt a thrill of defiance surge up my spine because the miscalculation was hers, and I would use every shred of knowledge, every note, every record to reclaim my life and confront the betrayal with clarity and precision. And then my daughter appeared at the doorway unexpectedly, her eyes darting to the floor first, then meeting mine briefly. And I felt a mixture of anger and longing because she was still my child, and yet she had chosen a path that aligned her with deceit. And I could see the subtle tension in her posture, the hesitation in her movements, the way she was holding back something from me. And I knew that whatever confrontation came next would not only reveal Evelyn's role, but also test the fragile remnants of trust that remained between us. And I braced myself because the emotional weight would be heavy, and I could not predict the outcome. I spent the rest of the night reviewing old letters from both Evelyn and my daughter, reading every line, every word, looking for clues about the plan I was uncovering and the motives behind it. And as dawn approached, the house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood, and I felt a steady resolve in my chest because the pieces were aligning, the story was forming, and I was ready to act with evidence and clarity, no longer moved by emotion alone. And I whispered to myself that the time of waiting was over, the time of careful observation was done, and the time of truth was here, and I would face it head on. No matter the cost, no matter the heartbreak, no matter how far it cut into the life I thought I knew.
The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I had not felt in weeks, a quiet determination that cut through the fear and grief that had settled in my chest, and I moved through the house carefully, scanning every surface, opening every drawer, checking every envelope, every folder, because I knew the pattern of deception was deliberate and meticulous, and I needed to understand it fully before confronting anyone. And as I worked, the sunlight fell through the windows in slanted golden lines across the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced slowly in the air. And I felt a strange sense of calm in the midst of chaos, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting blindly. I was preparing, gathering, and organizing my evidence. And each small discovery strengthened the resolve, building steadily in my chest like a slow-burning fire. I found letters from Evelyn tucked behind old photo albums, notes my daughter had left that hinted at conversations I had never been meant to hear, and small financial statements that clearly indicated movements meant to go unnoticed. And as I traced the connections and timelines, the full picture began to emerge, a web of quiet betrayals orchestrated over weeks, months, maybe even years. And I realized that every seemingly insignificant action, every smile, every polite word had been part of a strategy to distance me and take what was mine. And the weight of that understanding pressed down on me in a way that made my hands shake and my heart ache, because the people I loved most had chosen deceit over family, over loyalty, over love. And yet, amid the ache, a steady strength rose because I understood that knowledge was power and preparation was my shield, and that I could face this deliberately now and with precision.
and I spent the afternoon gathering copies, photographs, account statements, letters, everything organized carefully into neat piles, ready to be presented if necessary. And as I did so, I could hear the faint sounds of life outside my windows: birds calling, children laughing, neighbors going about their days, and the normalcy of it made the betrayal feel sharper, more surreal, more cutting, because it existed quietly alongside the ordinary, and I knew that confronting it would be messy, painful, and irreversible, but also necessary. By evening, I had constructed a full timeline, a map of interactions and transactions and subtle manipulations, and I felt the cold fire of resolve in my chest because the truth was now tangible, solid, and undeniable. And I knew that once revealed, it would change everything between me, my daughter, and Evelyn. And I could not undo that. And I would have to face both the friend who had betrayed decades of trust and the child who had chosen complicity. But I was ready, because for too long I had been passive, too long I had waited, too long for signs that might never come, and now I would step forward fully aware, fully prepared, fully determined to reclaim what had been taken. As the house grew quiet with the falling night, I sat at the dining table, surrounded by evidence, and whispered softly to myself that soon the confrontation would come, that I would face them both, and that every carefully hidden truth would finally be exposed. And I would not flinch. I would not back down. I would face the betrayal head on, because some things cannot be left unchallenged. Some truths cannot be ignored. And I had reached the point where protecting myself, protecting what was mine, protecting the memory of all the years of love and trust mattered more than fear or hesitation or heartbreak. And I felt the steady pulse of determination as night deepened around me, ready to carry me into whatever came next.
The day of confrontation came quietly, like a storm that waits just beyond the horizon, and I felt my heart beat steadily as I prepared myself, gathering the documents, letters, photographs, and account statements that proved everything, because I knew that only truth presented clearly and calmly would give me any chance of reclaiming what had been stolen. And when they arrived, the house felt smaller, tighter, the air thick with unspoken tension, and I watched Evelyn and my daughter step inside together, their smiles polite but parted, their movements precise like performers aware of the audience. And I realized in that moment that the past weeks, the months of careful observation, had all led to this one fragile but decisive instant, where everything could be revealed and nothing could be undone. I began slowly, presenting the evidence, the letters, the altered statements, the notes, the timeline of deliberate manipulations, and I could see their faces shift as recognition flickered behind practiced expressions. And I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and fury, because the people I had loved most had consciously chosen deceit over loyalty, over family, over trust. And yet in their eyes, I also saw fear for the first time, genuine fear, as they realized that the web they had woven was now laid bare, and the power they thought they held slipped like sand through their fingers. And I watched my daughter's lips part and close without words, and Evelyn's confident smile falter, and I felt the first rush of vindication and grief combined, because winning was never going to feel like joy. The confrontation stretched through hours, a quiet, tense negotiation of truth and denials, half-truths, evasions, and admissions, and I held firm, showing every piece of evidence, every carefully documented moment, until both were forced to acknowledge what had been done. And I could see the fracture lines deepen between them as Evelyn realized my daughter had been swayed fully into complicity, and my daughter realized the consequences of aligning herself with betrayal, and the weight of it fell across us all. And I realized that victory in court or in argument could not heal the loss of innocence, the loss of trust, the loss of what had once been a bond so strong it had seemed unbreakable. And yet, as the legal battles began and settlements were secured and the estate reclaimed, I felt an emptiness that no triumph could fill, because the house no longer felt like home. The warmth I had known with my daughter and the friend I had trusted was gone.
replaced by silence, caution, and memory. And I understood that while I had regained what was mine, the cost had been immense. The family fractured, the trust destroyed, the shared laughter vanished into echoes, and even the proof in my hands could not restore the past or make the wounds disappear. I sat finally alone in the study, the windows open to the late afternoon sun, and I held the letters, the documents, the photographs that had guided me through the storm, and I whispered softly to myself that justice had been served, but at a price that could never be repaid. And I understood that some betrayals leave scars deeper than money or possessions, and that some truths are necessary even when they hurt most. And I promised quietly that I would remember everything and guard what remained of my family, my home, my life, my heart. And though the echoes of betrayal lingered, I felt a cautious hope that one day the broken pieces might settle into a new pattern, a new understanding. And I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, letting the quiet strength that had carried me through the worst finally rest around me like a protective embrace, because even in loss and pain there was survival, there was clarity, there was me.